Welcome to RHI's Sociable City Interviews, where we meet with global thought leaders on nightlife and the social economy. Today, we are joined by Kim Casey, Director of Accessibility at Ablr, bringing over 2 decades of experience in the accessibility industry, where she creates accessible products, content, and training.
Well, hello. It's great to see you, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you. I've known John for a number of years. I really respect the work that he does, and I, I wanted to make sure we had a presentation again this year at our summit. And I thought it would be a great opportunity for you, since you're right there in Sacramento, to be a part of this process. Um, yeah, so why don't you give me a little bit of background of who you are and then move into how do you say it? Abler?
Abler, that's right.
Abler, yeah.
Yes.
So Abler, it's history and its mission.
All right, great. Thank you. So happy to be here, Jim. So you mentioned John, and I also ran into John kind of serendipitously. We were trying to build out a workforce innovation center, and John happened to be kind of consulting on the whole thing. And our working relationship grew to, hey, I've got this really cool thing with Abler that I'd like to start. And would you like to join me? So, but fast forward about 20 years. I was in college, taking odd jobs here and there. And I stumbled upon one. It was kind of an office assistant job. And the gentleman who was running the company is blind. And he said, I want to make maps for people. This was before GPS on all cell phones. I mean, it was before cell phones even. He said, I want to make maps. I want to make them electronic, or they are made electronic. I want to make them accessible for people who are blind. So I said, great, that sounds interesting, way more interesting than what I had been doing up until that time. But I really didn't know what I was getting into. And so, very similar to the hospitality, uh, industry is the travel industry, where, before this time, when we only had paper maps, people who were blind were kind of reliant on people saying, this is where you are, this is where you want to go. You can count the number of blocks to get there. Well, now we have this technology where people can be walking down the street, hearing what street they're on, hearing restaurants that they want to visit. And we were even working on really cool things like pulling in restaurant menus. And so it's this whole freedom thing. And I think the same thing goes in the hospitality, is that when you open your doors and make experiences accessible when they weren't before, is, you become such a greater experience all around. And so, I had different plans. I was on a different study path, but I ended up staying with accessibility. And we worked on that software all the way up until it became on the iPhones and the Androids, when it was like a free to a $2 download, and people could have maps in the palm of their hands and be able to have access to this information. So after that 20-year period is when we both started branching out, and my boss met John. And at that time, John was working on what he was calling LCI Tech. And then we kind of just grouped together, and John said, hey, would you like to join my team? We're going to do everything accessible. So Abler was born out of one of the largest employers of the blind, a company called LC Industries in North Carolina, Durham, North Carolina. And the point of LCI Tech, which was before Abler became, was to create upward mobility in jobs for people with disabilities, because there's underemployment there, there's unemployment there. And, John, being someone who is blind as well, realized that there's a huge opportunity there. And he had connections, he had networks, he had friends in the industry, he had ways to get a job. And yet he was struggling himself as he was filling out applications. He was struggling to fill out any online applications, any email communications. Sometimes things that were sent back to him just weren't accessible. So he realized there was a huge gap for people with disabilities, that we need, number one, to have, and this is really what Abler's 3 pillars are built on, is we have to have accessible digital information, so websites and anything that you are presenting. And then we also, once we have that, these companies need to kind of have a change in mindset, where they realize that this isn't going to be the same as before. We aren't going to be able to employ the same methods, but there is a good way to do this. And so we kind of have to change that mindset and give training. And how do you train somebody with a disability? How do you make sure that everybody's performing at their top level? And then the third part of that is ensuring that we have enough talent. So we have all these partners of companies that want to work with us, want to place all of our clients, and so we have to build those talent streams. So people with disabilities often get limited in when they're growing up. Maybe they're told you're never going to be able to do that. I know my children, they were diagnosed with celiac, so they were told, well, you can never work for NASA, that kind of thing. So it's like they get limited and they put these little invisible ceilings on top of them, and they think, well, I can't do that. That's something I'll never be able to do. And so what our third program and third pillar really is the most exciting is we're teaching people like, hey, the sky is the limit. If you have the determination, we can give you the skills so that you can get whatever job you want.
Hmm.
And so we're upskilling everyone, making sure that they can get the job they want, and they're not just taking those typical jobs that maybe not as fulfilling for somebody who has a really sharp eye for mathematics or coding or customer service. There's all these jobs out there that people can be placed in.
So is your primary focus people with visual disabilities or impairments?
Yeah, so we actually started on the easy end. So we were very familiar with being LCI being the largest employer of people who are blind. So we thought definitely that's a great test population. And we still focus on that. A lot of our employees are people who are native screen reader users. They're totally blind themselves. CEO of Ablr is also blind. um, and so we kind of have that user story, but it's accessibility is something where there's a lot of overlap, and it's not just, you can't just fit somebody into a set bucket. And so we do also usability testing for large companies. They'll say, hey, we're building out this new feature, can you give us 20 people's opinion on this new feature? And so we'll pull from a large base of people with visual impairments, hearing impairments, mobility impairments, and even cognitive, and say, what's your experience? How can we improve this experience? So it's actually been
So
a really fun job, definitely going from that kind of narrow travel focus to saying, here, I'm going to open up whatever you want opened, because we can make the world accessible if it's digital.
So your main focus then is around the digital aspect of opening up doors and creating opportunities for people, not only the people who are seeking work, but the employers who are seeking employees. What would
Absolutely.
motivate employees to be reaching out to you to try to find people who may have some impairments versus just finding somebody who doesn't?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And we get it often. So what we find, and there's been studies done, I don't have the exact statistics, but they find that there's a huge untapped talent. Of course, we've not realized the extreme potential of these individuals. So we can, you kind of find this person who is just itching for the job that you have. And then also, these people tend to be very loyal employees. So, like, once they have the job, they're, everyone we've had at Abler, we've pretty much had from the beginning. We don't really have a lot of turnover. And if you think of that from like a training perspective, that's a really, it's a really huge savings if you don't have to keep rehiring and retraining everyone if you have someone who's stuck with you for a long time.
Mhm.
I think we celebrated one of our at LCI. So there's been someone there since for 50 years. Same
That's a long
job,
time.
same thing. She loves it. I don't know when she's planning on retiring, but she's happily going on 50 years now. So,
And the World Bank Organization has adopted social inclusion, and the Destination International also has adopted social inclusion. In fact, they put out a report about social inclusion for destination organizations,
mhm.
not only just about how they, within their own employment, can reach out and employ more people with disabilities, but also how can they market their cities as destinations for people and build in awareness about how welcoming their cities are. But what's interesting is that, some might say that social inclusion is just a new term for DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And And I know that you adopted a term called diversity inclusion, which is kind of an interesting kind of spin-off because it seems like wouldn't social inclusion include the disability community if you looked at it from a broader perspective, or do you feel like you need to have a special focus that looks at diversity inclusion?
We
I
actually
mean,
disability
disability
inclusion. Yeah,
inclusion. Yeah.
exactly. Um, so yes, we did find actually. So I'm not one to be really a stickler on what is being called what. I'm all about inclusion, period. And so it doesn't matter how it's introduced, as long as it's bettering the experience for someone's. But for disability inclusion, what we were finding was that a lot of times DEI and those types of initiatives were including everyone but people with disabilities. It was kind of a limited scope where it was like, yes, everyone's included. But when it came time to actually hiring somebody with a disability, it felt like we needed to put in that extra effort and give, like, let's give employers a step by step approach on how to employ people with disabilities so that it's not something that feels overwhelming.
Hmm.
And yeah, so it just felt, I know our CEO, he was in a position where he lost his job, had just had a baby, just bought a house. What am I going to do? And he applied to job after job. It was taking him at least an hour each to fill out each application. And it just became this huge thing where, he would put in all this effort and not get a call back. And it
Hmm.
was like, what's blocking him from? And he had connections and networks, and it still felt like it was really hard for him to get a job. He was lucky to end up back in his hometown, North Carolina, in Cary, North Carolina, and end up with a job that it was, obviously got us here today. But, not everybody has that network. Not everybody has all of those resources. So what he wanted to create with Abler was exactly that experience. Let's make it easy for people with disabilities to get jobs, to have the skills they need to get the jobs, and then also make those connections with employers that are willing to try something new.
Now, a lot of our focus is around hospitality, and that includes, dining and entertainment establishments, public events like music festivals and outdoor
Mhm.
markets, and other types of social activities. And so sociability and the need that people have to socialize is obviously a universal human need. And that doesn't matter whether you have a disability or you don't have a disability. I mean, it's just a basic intrinsic need. But so many opportunities are denied to people, both from employment and as well as guests. And so, why should hospitality businesses, restaurants and bars, hotels, and other travel organizations uh, want to expand their outreach and be much more known as a business that hires people and welcomes guests and will make not necessarily just the legal accommodations that are necessary, but go over and above and be creative in how they make those accommodations.
Absolutely. Why is a good question, because all of the bottom line, the business sense it makes perfect sense. Why would you exclude a population that has a large amount of disposable income from anything that you're doing if you're running a business? We've had businesses approach us and say, look, we know we're missing out on this demographic and we want to include them. Once you do that, then you become the company that actually put in the effort. And then what you see in the disability community is that everybody talks, and you get loyal customers, you get loyal friends and family. So it's not just for people with disabilities, but if you have, say, a friend who has a disability and you see that, hey, they can go and they can book a table independently and they can go to the restaurant and read the menu and it's an enjoyable experience for them. They're not dreading it. You're gonna that's a great restaurant, let's go back there, and that sort of thing. Like you were saying, why wouldn't cities want to have that positive reputation? And that's really, I don't know the answer to that, but it's maybe a lack of knowledge. A lot of my work throughout this entire my entire career has been that people just need to know that it's really, we're not asking that much. It's just a matter of tweaking and making things work for everybody.
We talk about the veto vote. It's a term that I came up with when we started to talk about the non-alcoholic beverage, the people who don't drink alcohol. And then it became, people who were vegetarian and then now vegan and then gluten-free or whatever. So there's always one person in a group that has a special accommodation that they need.
Absolutely.
And if they're with a group of friends, a lot of times those friends will concede to go with a place or a location that will accommodate that one person.
Yeah.
So, when we try to talk to businesses, we say, look, you may think you don't have a lot of customers who you would get who have disabilities, but think about all of the customers you lose because their friends aren't going to come because you're not accommodating them. So,
Yeah.
so instead of losing one customer, you're losing maybe 4 to 6 customers because you're not offering that vegan option, or you're not offering the quality non-alcoholic beverage, or you're not offering a menu that could be read by somebody who has a visual impairment, you know, or that your facility isn't easily accessible to somebody in a wheelchair or walker. So I think that concept, the way you talk about it, is really trying to put it into a business perspective.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, and that's the thing too, is that we find people with disabilities, they aren't likely to come to you and say, "Hey, I don't like this service," or "I feel left out." They're just going to move to the next restaurant or the next experience, and they're going to
Hmm.
skip out on yours. You'll never even know that you lost that customer. And that's, that unknown expense that a lot of companies, if they aren't paying attention to disability inclusion, are going to suffer. I know, just from a personal aspect, I will go to a restaurant, I will pay extra, probably double what everybody else pays for their food, if they can guarantee me safe food for my children.
Hmm.
And so it's like they don't know how important it is to me, but I'll pay for it, and I'll pay for it
Hmm.
again and again. But there's all these other restaurants that, kind of blow us off and maybe say, yeah, yeah, we were kind of safe, or we can't guarantee. Well, okay, I'm going to take my business elsewhere. And it's a huge kind of ripple effect when you think
Hmm.
about it, that it's not just the one customer that, like I've never seen a person in a wheelchair at my restaurant. Well, why not? Probably not because, you know, they didn't want to come.
That's true. That's true. Yeah, 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 yeah. I remember doing a lot of interviews back when I did those articles in the '80s about that same concept. I never have anybody with a wheelchair come to my restaurant, and then it's like, well, do you have a ramp, and how accessible are your restrooms?
Exactly.
And maybe those are the reasons why people aren't coming. It's not that they don't want to come. It's just that you're not making it easy for them to come.
Right. You're putting an unseen sign on the front saying you're not welcome here, or
Yeah,
I'm
well,
going to make this as difficult as possible.
well, you make a great case for all of the economic benefits, the employment benefits, the advocacy, the opportunities that people have to, engage in social activities on an equal plane. But there are political, that not only social forces, but there's mounting political forces that it seems may make your work more difficult. I mean, how do you see things evolving over the next few years? You even mentioned that you lost some funding already, and what's going to happen with the people that you're there to help and to work with?
Yeah, well, I've been in this space for a really long time, and it tends to be very cyclical. So, like I tell everybody, I'm very optimistic. So I'm going to wait and see what happens. And, of course, Abler's a very gritty company. We make things work even when we don't feel like, even when we're fighting that uphill battle. But I feel like at the end of the day, this is something that matters. And I mean, I feel like it couldn't have kept my attention for 25 years if it
Hmm.
wasn't something that mattered, and it wasn't something that was going to work out in the end. So I stay hopeful for all of that.
Hmm.
I'm not
Hmm.
too worried about temporary legislation and whatnot.
Oh, okay. Well, that's a great attitude. It's a great way to move forward. I think obviously you work with a constituency who have had to live their lives with that same kind of attitude.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah,
maybe you picked up some of that from the people that you work with.
I hope so. I've
Yeah,
worked with some really great people.
yeah. Well, this has been a great opportunity to talk with you, and I wish you a lot of luck. And I know that in Sacramento, when we have our summit, I'm sure that people will be really interested in what you have to say.
Great. I'm looking forward to meeting everyone.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.